Sometimes a single tear from a stranger can change the course of an entire life. The morning train screeched into the small Montana station, cutting through the endless hush of prairie wind and distant thunder. Dust swirled across the platform, carried by a cold gust that smelled of rain. Margaret Whitmore stood there, arms folded against her chest, her face set in the same still expression she'd worn for years. The station clock ticked lazily overhead, counting the minutes she'd promised herself she wouldn't regret. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe disappointment, maybe awkward silence, but certainly not the sharp pull in her chest when she saw him step down from the train. James Hartley. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters, his shoulders broader, his gait measured but weary, like a man who had carried too much for too long. A battered trunk hung from one hand, the other tucked into his coat pocket. He looked around uncertainly until his eyes found her, and in that moment the air between them seemed to shift. Margaret had spent the last 4 years fortifying herself against the world, burying softness under practicality, grief under work. Yet one look at this stranger, a man whose words she'd come to rely on, felt like the first crack in a dam she thought unbreakable. He approached with a hesitant smile. "Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice was steady but quiet, the kind of voice that carried calm even in uncertainty. She nodded, straightening her posture. "Mr. Hartley," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The wind pushed against their coats, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and iron rails. Then James shifted his trunk and said softly, "You look exactly as I thought you might." It wasn't flattery. It was truth spoken gently. Margaret didn't know what to say to that. Compliments had no place in her life anymore. She gestured toward the wagon hitched nearby. "We should go. It's a long ride to the farm, and there's weather coming." He followed her without argument, his boots crunching on the gravel. The silence between them was not unfriendly, only uncertain, like two people walking towards something they couldn't yet name. When they reached the wagon, James set his trunk in the back and helped her up before climbing beside her. The old horse, steadfast, snorted against the bit as Margaret clicked the reins. The journey began in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the low rumble of distant thunder. Margaret could feel James studying the landscape, the endless expanse of golden fields bending under the weight of wind. She knew what he saw, a land that was harsh, demanding, yet beautiful in its endurance. It had taken everything from her husband, her peace, but it had also kept her alive. Finally, James spoke. "It's more beautiful than you described in your letters." Margaret gave a small shrug. "Hard to capture everything in words." "That's true," he said, glancing at her. "Still, your letters painted something real. I could see it. The way you wrote about the light on the wheat, the quiet of the mornings. I think I started to miss it before I ever saw it." The honesty in his tone unsettled her. She focused on the horizon, where gray clouds gathered like bruises. "Letters are safer than real life," she murmured. "They don't ask for much." "No," he said thoughtfully, "but they can still tell the truth." Margaret didn't reply. Truth was something she'd avoided for years. Truth meant remembering Thomas, her late husband, and the fever that took him before they'd even finished building the second barn. Truth meant nights alone with only the wind for company. Letters had been a strange salvation, an outlet without risk, until now. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold against her hands. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter, watching as James tilted his head toward the sky, smiling faintly. "Smells like home," he said. "Where I'm from, storms always meant the start of something new." "Here," she said quietly. "They usually mean something's about to break." They reached the farmhouse just as the rain began to pour in earnest. Margaret climbed down, her boots sinking into the wet earth. James followed, grabbing his trunk. She noticed the scar on his knuckles as he lifted it, a faint white line across his skin. A working man's hands, she thought, strong, capable, but marked by hardship. Inside, the house was warm but sparse. Margaret lit a lamp, its glow flickering across plain furniture and clean, empty spaces. It's not much, she said, but it's mine. James smiled. It looks like a place built by someone who refuses to give up. Something in his words softened her, though she tried not to show it. She set out a cup of coffee, strong and black, and they sat at the small kitchen table. The rain beat harder against the windows, thunder rolling across the plains. James looked around the room as if trying to memorize it. You said in your last letter that the storms here sound like the sky arguing with itself. Margaret gave a reluctant smile. You remember that? I remember everything you wrote, he said simply. The way he said it, without hesitation, without artifice, made her pulse quicken. For a moment she saw not the stranger who'd stepped off the train, but the man whose words had reached her when nothing else could. The man who had written, "Grief is the price we pay for love, but I'd rather pay it than live without the chance to love again." He was still looking at her when lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Margaret flinched, spilling her coffee slightly. James reached across the table instinctively, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief but electric, a spark that neither acknowledged but both felt. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and the walls of the house seemed to hum with the storm's fury. James rose to his feet, peering out toward the fields. "You should have someone help you reinforce that barn door," he said. "Looks like it won't hold through the night." "I've managed worse alone," she replied, standing too. "I don't doubt that," he said quietly. "But you don't have to anymore." The words hung between them, simple yet dangerous. Margaret turned away, her throat tight. He couldn't know what that offer meant to someone who had spent years surviving solitude like a second skin. The storm outside raged harder. In the flash of another lightning bolt, James's reflection caught in the window glass. His face solemn, steady and wet with the faint shimmer of rain that had followed him inside. Margaret blinked, and for a moment she thought she saw a tear trace down his cheek. Or perhaps it was just the rain. Either way, it struck something deep within her chest, an ache that felt terrifyingly close to hope. As thunder rolled across the plains and the light flickered, Margaret found herself whispering into the shadows, "What are you doing here, James Hartley?" He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with quiet certainty. "Maybe," he said. "I came to find something I lost a long time ago." The wind roared against the windows, and in that moment Margaret felt the strange, undeniable pull of fate, a force as vast and unpredictable as the prairie itself. Why does Margaret, who vowed never to love again, feel like she's meeting the man her soul already knows? You can't build a future until you face what's buried in the past. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke just as the sun disappeared behind the jagged edge of the mountains. The Montana sky, once washed in gold, turned the color of pewter. Rain streaked across the window panes and wind rattled the shutters as if demanding entry. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret moved with practiced efficiency, lighting another lamp, pulling thick curtains closed, stoking the fire until it hissed and cracked with heat. She could feel James's presence behind her even before he spoke, the weight of him filling the quiet room like another piece of weather she hadn't planned for. He stood near the hearth, coat still damp, eyes taking in the modest home. The simple table, the worn rug, the sturdy wooden chair that had once belonged to her father. "It's a good house," he said softly. "You've done well keeping it." Margaret didn't look at him. Praise always sat uneasy on her shoulders. "It's what's left," she replied curtly. "A house doesn't care if you keep it. It just stands or it doesn't." The words came out sharper than intended, but James only nodded. "Still," he said, "you made sure it stood." His calm unsettled her. Everything about him did. In letters, he'd been easy to manage, ink on paper, safely distant. But now, flesh and bone, voice and gaze, he was something entirely different. His presence stirred things in her chest she'd buried under seasons of grief. She turned away, busied herself with unnecessary chores, stacking wood that didn't need stacking, wiping already clean dishes. Anything to keep from meeting those eyes that seemed to see too much. The fire popped, and for a moment the light flickered across the framed photograph on the mantel. Her late husband, Thomas Whitmore, smiling stiffly beside her on their wedding day. Margaret froze mid-motion. She hadn't realized she'd left that picture there. The image, faded from sun and time, stared back at her like an accusation. James followed her gaze. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. Margaret swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. "Was. He's been gone 4 years." "I'm sorry," James said. And she believed he meant it. There was no pity in his tone, only understanding, the kind that comes from shared pain. "I lost my wife," he added after a pause. 3 winters ago. The fire started in the workshop. I tried to get to her, but—" His voice caught, rough and low. "Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see the smoke." Margaret turned slowly, her heart tightening. "I didn't know," she said. "It wasn't something I could write," he admitted. "Some memories don't fit on paper." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and heavy. The storm outside lashed against the walls, the wind howling through the eaves like the ghosts of every memory they didn't dare speak aloud. 2 people, each carrying loss like a second shadow, now stood within arm's reach of each other, and neither knew what to do with that nearness. Finally, Margaret moved toward the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she poured them both fresh coffee. "Loss changes you," she said quietly. "Turns you into someone you don't quite recognize." James accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "It does," he agreed. "But maybe it doesn't have to keep us there." The words were gentle, but they struck something deep in her. She thought of all the nights she'd sat alone in this house, staring into the dark, telling herself solitude was safer than hope. Hope had teeth. It bit, and it bled you dry when it left. And yet here he was, sitting in her kitchen, speaking as though healing were a choice she could still make. Outside, thunder cracked close enough to shake the floorboards. The sound rolled over the plains, followed by the sharp clatter of rain on the tin roof. Margaret set her cup down and went to check the latch on the window. Through the glass, she could see flashes of lightning crawling across the sky, jagged and brilliant. The wind had picked up, bending the trees until their branches scraped against the house like pleading hands. "We'll have to ride this one out," she said. "The plains don't forgive carelessness in weather like this." James moved to the other window, testing the shutters. "You face these storms alone?" "Always," she replied. "Who else would do it?" He hesitated, watching her as if memorizing the way she said alone. "You don't have to anymore." She turned sharply, the old reflex of defensiveness rising. "Mr. Hartley," she began, the formal name meant as distance. "You're a guest here, nothing more. I'm perfectly capable of managing what's mine." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "I never said you weren't capable, Margaret. I just said you don't have to." His use of her first name landed like a blow and a balm all at once. She hated how it made her chest ache. She opened her mouth to reply, but another crash of thunder cut her off, louder this time, closer. Then came a sound that froze her mid-step. A violent bang from outside, metal against wood. She ran to the door and yanked it open, the wind slamming against her as if trying to shove her back inside. Rain whipped across her face, cold and stinging. Through the sheets of water she saw it, the barn door swinging wildly on its hinges, one side already torn loose. "My wheat," she gasped. "If that shed blows open, it'll ruin everything." Before she could move, James grabbed his coat. "Stay inside," he shouted over the wind. "Don't you dare," she began, but he was already gone, plunging into the storm. Lightning illuminated him for a heartbeat, his form cutting across the rain, coat plastered to his back, determination in every step. The door slammed again, a sharp metallic cry against the chaos, and she saw him throw his shoulder into it, wrestling it back toward the frame. Margaret's heart pounded painfully. She wanted to run after him, to help, but the wind was too strong. The rain blurred everything into a haze of motion and sound. She could only watch, helpless, as James fought the storm itself, a single man against the fury of nature. The seconds stretched into forever. Then with one final burst of lightning, she saw him manage to drive the latch home. Relief surged through her chest, just before the world went white with another flash, followed by a sound like the sky tearing apart. "James!" she screamed, stepping out onto the porch as the thunder rolled like cannon fire. But through the rain she could just barely make out his silhouette, stumbling, then steadying himself, one hand pressed against his forehead. She ran forward, but he lifted his hand, motioning her back. Even from that distance, she could see the stubborn set of his jaw. He was hurt, but alive. The storm raged around them, a furious symphony of wind and rain and thunder. And in that chaos, Margaret felt something awaken, a terror not of loss, but of care. After years of believing she could never love again, the sight of him bleeding in her yard shattered every wall she'd built around her heart. She stood rooted, on the porch, rain soaking through her dress, unable to look away as he fought his way back toward the house. As thunder broke overhead, the barn door slammed open once more, and James, still staggering from the blow, turned back into the storm to protect her crops again. Some men prove their worth not in words, but in storms. The prairie storm hit with a force that could rattle the bones of the earth itself. Wind screamed across the open fields like a living beast, carrying sheets of rain that struck with the sting of thrown gravel. The farmhouse trembled under the weight of it all, windows rattling, shingles groaning, the sound of the land itself roaring in defiance. Inside, Margaret stood frozen at the window, one hand braced against the frame, eyes locked on the figure outside. James Hartley was out there, alone in the chaos, fighting against the wild fury of the wind to save the wheat shed that held the seed for her next season. The rain came so heavy it blurred the world into a smear of gray and silver. Yet she could still make out his form, hunched and determined, his coat snapping in the gale. He was holding the door against the wind, shoulders braced as if he could physically push back the sky. Each time lightning split the clouds, he was there, illuminated for an instant, a man carved out of sheer willpower, refusing to let go. "James!" she shouted into the storm, her voice swallowed instantly by the wind. She could barely see, barely think. Instinct screamed at her to help him, but the force of the rain nearly drove her backward as soon as she stepped outside. The mud pulled at her boots, her skirt tangled around her legs, and the world was nothing but wind and sound and fear. When she finally reached him, he turned, rain streaking down his face, eyes wild but steady. "Get back inside!" he bellowed, his voice cut through the storm like a whip. "I won't leave you out here," she yelled back, but the wind tore the words from her mouth. "Go!" he shouted again, and this time there was something in his tone that made her obey. Not command, not arrogance, protection. She stumbled backward toward the porch, watching helplessly as he threw his weight against the door once more. Thunder rolled so loud it shook the ground beneath her feet. She could see him straining, the muscles in his arms trembling, the hinge barely holding. He was fighting not just the wind, but the very hand of fate trying to tear away the only security she had left in this life. A violent gust ripped through the yard and something flew loose from the barn roof, a plank or beam she couldn't tell. It struck the ground near him with a sickening thud, splintering apart. James didn't move, didn't flinch. He just held on, jaw clenched, eyes burning with the kind of determination that made Margaret's throat ache. Then for a moment the storm seemed to shift direction, giving him just enough reprieve to slam the door shut and drive the latch home. He leaned into it, breath heaving, head bowed as though offering thanks to the rain itself. "James!" she called again, and this time he turned toward her. He took one unsteady step forward and then another, before the world went white with lightning. A crack of thunder followed so close it sounded like the heavens splitting apart. When the light faded, she saw him stumble, his hand flying to his head. He swayed once, twice, then crumpled into the mud. Margaret's scream was lost to the wind. She ran, skirts heavy with rain, slipping and sliding through the muck until she reached him. His face was pale beneath the grime and water, and blood mixed with rain as it streamed from a gash above his brow. "James!" she cried, shaking him gently. His eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, unfocused, then closed again. "Lord, help me," she whispered, gripping his arm. He was heavier than he looked, every inch of him muscle and bone. She hooked her hands under his shoulders and dragged him inch by grueling inch toward the porch. The storm battered her from all sides, the wind so fierce she thought it might lift them both and hurl them into the fields. But she kept pulling, one foot after another, refusing to let go. By the time she reached the porch, her breath came in ragged gasps, her arms trembling from effort. She managed to get him inside, the door slamming shut behind them with the finality of salvation. For a long moment she could do nothing but lean against the door, soaked and shaking. The sound of her own heartbeat louder than the storm still raging outside. Then she looked at him. James lay sprawled on the floorboards, his shirt clinging to his chest, blood mixing with rainwater in dark streaks across his temple. Margaret's fear shifted instantly into action. She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck. His pulse was strong, thank God. But the cut was deep, the skin torn. She rushed to the basin, grabbing a cloth and pitcher. As she poured water over the wound, his eyelids fluttered again. "Margaret," he muttered, voice rough, "is the shed—" "It's fine," she snapped, her voice trembling with anger she didn't understand. "You're not." He tried to sit up, but she pressed him back down. "Don't move, you fool, you're bleeding all over my floor." Despite the situation, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Sorry about that." She shook her head, dabbing the blood away, her hands trembling. The cut ran just above his eyebrow, jagged and ugly, the kind of wound that would scar. She pressed the cloth harder, trying to staunch the bleeding. "You could have died out there," she said, her voice breaking. "For what? For a door?" "For your wheat," he murmured. "For your future." Margaret froze. His words hit her like a physical blow. Her future. When had anyone ever cared about that but her? She swallowed hard, blinking away tears that mingled with the rain on her cheeks. "You're a fool," she said quietly. "A stubborn, impossible fool." He opened his eyes fully then, meeting hers. "You'd have done the same." She wanted to deny it, but they both knew it was true. She'd have faced that storm head-on for something that mattered. Maybe that's why she couldn't stop shaking, because somewhere deep down she knew that in his heart, she mattered too. The house creaked as another gust hit, the sound fading slowly as the storm began to move east. The thunder grew distant, and for the first time in hours there was silence. Margaret sat back on her heels, exhaustion washing through her. James lay still, breathing shallow but steady. She reached for the lamp on the table, its weak glow barely piercing the dark. When she lifted the light closer to his face, the sight made her chest tighten. The wound wasn't just a cut. It had a splinter embedded deep in it. A long, sharp piece of wood she recognized instantly. It had broken off from her own barn door, the one he'd risked his life to save. Her breath caught, her hand hovering over the wound. The splinter was hers, her barn's, her burden. And now, somehow her fault. Guilt twisted inside her, raw and unfamiliar. She'd spent years convincing herself she needed no one, that love only led to pain. Yet here was a man bleeding because he refused to let her stand alone. She leaned back, her pulse pounding, the storm still echoing faintly in the distance. The smell of rain clung to the air, sharp and clean. Somewhere deep within her, a realization took root, quiet, terrifying, undeniable. As Margaret reached for the lamp to examine his wound, she saw the splinter buried deep above his eye, and recognized it as a piece of her own barn door, the same one he had nearly died protecting. Healing a wound is easy. Healing what caused it is not. The storm still prowled around the farmhouse, grumbling against the walls like a living creature unwilling to leave. Every crack of thunder seemed to rattle through Margaret's bones as she worked, her hands trembling over the makeshift table where James sat slumped in a chair. A small lamp burned between them, casting an unsteady light that flickered across his face, pale, blood-streaked, and far too calm for a man who had nearly been crushed by a storm. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice more breath than sound. James gave a faint smile, the corner of his mouth twitching despite the gash across his forehead. "You said that already. And you're not listening," she replied, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. She pressed a clean cloth against the wound again, and his jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck standing out as he silently bore the pain. Blood welled up, warm and dark, staining her fingers. Margaret tried to focus on the task, not the way his closeness filled the room, not the heat radiating off his skin, not the maddening scent of rain and smoke clinging to him. The splinter, lodged in his brow, was deep. She could see the grain of the wood clearly now, the cruel irony of recognizing it, a piece of her own barn door, the one he had fought to close for her, the one that had wounded him. Guilt twisted inside her like another kind of storm. "This will hurt," she warned softly. He nodded once. "I know." Margaret took a breath, steadying her hands, then gripped the edge of the splinter with tweezers. The second it shifted, James's entire body tensed, his fingers curling into the edge of the table. But he didn't make a sound. She pulled slowly, carefully, until the wood came free with a wet snap. She dropped it into the basin and pressed the cloth against the bleeding gash, heart hammering as she saw the extent of it. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound stern. "It's not worth risking your life for wheat." James's breathing was slow and even, but his eyes opened, steady and unflinching. "It's not just wheat," he said quietly. "It's your future. That's worth the risk." She froze, cloth still in hand. The simple conviction in his tone, the absolute sincerity, struck deeper than any thunderclap outside. Her throat tightened. "No," she said after a long silence. "Nothing is worth you dying." "Then I didn't die," he murmured, a small, tired smile ghosting across his lips. "So maybe we both won." "Don't you dare make light of it," she said sharply. But her anger crumbled into something else before the words even finished leaving her mouth. The truth was, she wasn't angry, she was terrified. She pressed the cloth harder against his wound, blinking fast as tears blurred her vision. James reached up suddenly, his fingers curling around her wrist, not rough, not demanding, just steady. "Margaret," he said softly, "I'm fine. You're bleeding on me now." She looked down, startled to see crimson smears across her own hand where his blood had mixed with hers. "So we're even then," he said with a faint, lopsided grin. Margaret shook her head, but she couldn't stop the small, broken laugh that escaped her. "You're impossible. And you're stubborn," he said. "Seems we're a good match." The air between them shifted, a fragile warmth threading through the fading echoes of the storm. Margaret rinsed the wound, her touch gentler now, her movements slower. His skin was warm under her fingers, his breath steady, and for the first time, she realized just how close they were, how the space between their bodies had dissolved into something she didn't know how to name. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, unguarded. "I've stitched worse wounds than this," she said half to herself, "but my hands have never shaken like this." James's eyes softened. "Because this one matters more." Margaret met his gaze, her heart thudding painfully. There was no teasing in his voice, no attempt at charm, just truth, plain and quiet and devastating. She turned away before he could see how much it affected her, setting a small needle into the lamp flame until it glowed faintly. Then she threaded it with her steadiest line, though her fingers trembled so badly she nearly dropped it twice. "This will hurt more than the splinter," she warned again. James leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "I trust you." The words froze her mid-motion. She looked up slowly, the needle still poised in her hand. "You what?" "I trust you," he repeated, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. Something inside her cracked wide open. Trust was not something she'd been given easily, nor something she'd dared to offer since Thomas died. The idea that someone could hand it to her so freely felt foreign, frightening, and achingly beautiful. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus, and began to stitch. Each careful puncture made her flinch more than it seemed to bother him. He sat still, breathing evenly, his eyes closed. Rain still beat against the windows, but softer now. The fury of the storm slowly easing into rhythm. When she tied off the final stitch, she sat back with a shaky exhale. "Done," she managed. James opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "See? I told you I was fine. You have 7 stitches in your forehead," she said, voice thick with exhaustion and something she couldn't name. "That's not fine," he chuckled softly. "I've had worse." "Not here you haven't," she muttered, cleaning away the last of the blood. Her fingers brushed the edge of his hair, and the touch lingered longer than it should have. She pulled her hand back quickly, but not before she saw the flicker of emotion in his eyes. Something warm, steady, patient. Outside, the storm grumbled one last time before beginning to fade into the distance. The air in the house felt different now. Still heavy, but with the kind of quiet that comes after a confession neither meant to make. Margaret rose to pour fresh water into the basin, but her knees nearly gave out halfway there. "Sit," James said gently. "You look ready to collapse." "I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice betrayed her, thin and unsteady. He smiled faintly. "You don't have to be fine all the time." That simple sentence hit her harder than the storm had. She turned to face him, water dripping from her sleeves, the lamplight catching the wet shine of tears she didn't bother to hide this time. "I can't lose someone else," she whispered. I can't. I won't survive it again." James stood slowly, moving toward her with care like one might approach a skittish animal. He stopped just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You won't have to," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere, Margaret, not unless you send me away." His words lingered in the dim air, fragile and real. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. They stood in silence, 2 broken people bound by shared scars, the storm outside echoing the one inside her chest. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt the faint, terrifying stirrings of something she thought she'd buried forever. Hope. Why does that simple trust feel more dangerous than the lightning still flashing outside? When the world gives you storms, sometimes the only answer is to dance through them. The storm outside refused to fully die. Rain still lashed the windows in long, uneven streaks, the wind sighing low like a creature catching its breath after a battle. But inside the farmhouse, there was a rare and fragile calm. The fire burned steady now, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and strong coffee. Margaret had changed into dry clothes, an old flannel shirt that hung loose around her shoulders. And James, freshly bandaged, sat at the table looking impossibly alive for a man who had nearly been split open by lightning and wind. Neither spoke for a long while. The quiet between them was not awkward, only full, like the silence after a hymn. Margaret poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, the faint clink of porcelain the only sound. When she handed one to James, their fingers brushed, and the simple contact made her heart stumble in her chest. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "For taking care of me," he added after a pause. "For being foolish enough to risk your neck for my wheat," she replied, trying for sarcasm but finding only softness. James smiled faintly. "You call it foolish, I call it purpose." They drank in silence, the lamplight painting their faces gold. The rhythm of the rain outside had softened into a steady percussion. The storm's fury spent, but its presence lingering like an old ghost unwilling to leave. After a time, James spoke again. "Tell me something," he said, his tone curious but gentle. "Something I wouldn't know from your letters." Margaret stared into her coffee, thinking. The letters, dozens of them over months, had been her one fragile connection to the world beyond her land. Through them, she'd shared practical details. Her thoughts about planting, the repairs needed before winter, but never the deeper things, never the pieces of herself she'd locked away. "I used to dance," she said finally, almost to the mug in her hands. James looked up, his brow creasing slightly. "Dance?" She nodded, a small, wistful smile tugging at her mouth. My parents loved music. My father played the fiddle, and my mother, she'd hum while she cooked. After supper, he'd take her hand, spin her around the kitchen, and I'd laugh until my sides hurt. When I got older, they taught me the steps. Waltzes, reels, all the old ones. We used to dance right here in this room when winter storms kept us trapped indoors. Her gaze drifted toward the window, toward the dark reflection of the world beyond. After they died, the music stopped. I told myself I didn't have time for foolishness like that anymore. But the truth is, it just hurt too much. James' eyes softened. Do you miss it? Yes, she said, surprising herself with the honesty. But it felt wrong somehow, like I didn't deserve to dance when they weren't here to see it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The rain whispered. Then James stood slowly and extended his hand toward her. Dance with me, he said. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. What, now? There's no music and there's a storm. There's always been a storm, he said gently. Inside, outside, it doesn't matter, but we're here, we're alive, and life's too short to wait for perfect conditions. He kept his hand outstretched, patient, a small smile playing at his lips. The lamplight gleamed against the bandage on his forehead, making him look both fragile and unyielding at once. Margaret stared at his hand, at the strength of it, the roughness of a man who'd worked and lost and still had the courage to offer something tender. Every part of her screamed that this was a bad idea, that closeness only led to pain. But another part, smaller and braver, whispered something else. She set her mug down and placed her hand in his. James's grip was steady, warm. He drew her gently to her feet, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. We'll start simple, he said, his tone light but reverent. Don't say I didn't warn you, she muttered. He chuckled softly, then began to hum, a simple tune, low and slightly off-key, but familiar enough that her feet found the rhythm before her mind caught up. He took a step. She followed. It was clumsy at first. They bumped into the table. She stepped on his foot. They both laughed, the sound startling and sweet in the quiet room. As they moved, the memory of old dances returned, slowly, tentatively, like light creeping into a long-shuttered room. The kitchen transformed around them. The flickering lamp became a chandelier. The worn boards beneath their feet a polished floor. The air itself seemed to glow, warm and full of something she hadn't felt in years. Joy. Margaret's laughter died down into a small smile as they swayed together. The rain's rhythm softened to a whisper against the glass, and she let herself lean into the steady heat of James's body. The humming faded, but neither stopped moving. Their steps slowed until they were barely swaying, their breath in sync. I'm not very good at this anymore, she said quietly. You're perfect, he said so simply that she almost didn't catch it. Margaret looked up at him. His face was only inches away, eyes dark and unreadable, but full of something that made her chest ache. She wanted to look away, to hide, but couldn't. The world felt impossibly small in that moment, just the two of them, a flickering lamp, the smell of rain, and the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't hers. James, she said softly, though she didn't know what she meant to follow it with. He didn't let her finish. Margaret, he said, his voice a low tremor, I need to tell you something. Her breath hitched. What is it? He hesitated for a heartbeat, then spoke the words that would change everything. I came here hoping we could build something together, hoping what we found in letters could turn into something real. But I need you to know, I'm already halfway in love with you, maybe more than halfway. The words struck like lightning, but warm instead of burning. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back slightly, her pulse hammering. James, you can't mean... I do, he said simply. I know it's fast. I know you've been hurt. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just can't pretend anymore. She stared at him, every wall she'd built screaming to rise, to shut him out. But her heart, the heart that had been dormant for so long, beat against those walls with desperate strength. Don't, she whispered. Please don't say things you can't take back." "I don't want to take them back," he said. The rain had softened to a drizzle now, the last sighs of the storm fading into the dark. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, fragile. Margaret turned away, staring into the dying fire. He'd bled for her. He'd trusted her. And now he'd given her something even riskier than his safety. His heart. As the wind quieted and the last echoes of thunder faded away, James whispered that he was already halfway in love with her. And Margaret froze, caught between the instinct to flee and the aching pull to fall. When the world survives the night, it looks different in the light. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Dawn broke soft and gold across the Montana plains, the kind of fragile light that made even the scars of destruction look beautiful. The farmhouse still stood strong, its white paint streaked with rain, the air filled with the scent of wet earth and pine. The only sounds were the soft drip of water from the eaves and the slow, tired breathing of a world that had fought its way through chaos and survived. Margaret stood at the window, one hand on the sill, watching steam rise from the soaked fields. The wheat was still standing, bent in places but not broken. Her heart swelled with relief so deep it hurt. Behind her she could hear the faint creak of floorboards as James stirred, the slow rustle of a man waking in unfamiliar peace. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair still damp from washing, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, she almost forgot to breathe. The bandage above his eyebrow had already begun to darken where the wound bled through again. But he looked alive, so utterly alive it made her chest tighten. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. "Morning," she replied, still watching the sunlight creep across the wet fields. "You shouldn't be up. You need rest." James gave a faint smile. "If I lie down any longer, I'll start to feel like an invalid. And I'd rather not have you think you married a delicate man." Margaret froze, startled by the casual slip of the word married. He didn't seem to notice. He was already reaching for the kettle, moving about her kitchen as though he belonged there. The sight stirred something strange in her, a mixture of comfort and alarm. "You're bleeding again," she said finally. He touched the edge of the bandage, grimaced faintly. "It's nothing." "Sit," she ordered, pointing to the chair. "I'll rewrap it." He obeyed, grinning slightly. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't mock me," she said, though the corner of her mouth betrayed her. "I've had worse patients than you, but not many as stubborn." As she replaced the bandage, he studied her face, focused, serious, framed by a loose strand of hair that had escaped her braid. He'd seen her fierce before, commanding, cold even. But this version of her, gentle and careful, was something new. When she finished, he caught her wrist lightly before she could pull away. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "For last night. For everything." She met his gaze, her pulse skipping. "You should be thanking your own hard head. I thought you'd cracked it open for sure." He chuckled softly, then looked toward the window. "It's beautiful out there," he said. "The air smells like the world's been reborn." Margaret followed his gaze. Outside, sunlight glinted off puddles like glass, and the barn, though battered, still stood. She exhaled slowly, the tension of the long night finally beginning to fade. "Come on," she said, reaching for her boots. "Let's see how bad it really is." They stepped out into the morning together, the porch boards still slick beneath their feet. The fields stretched wide and golden under the new light, rows of wheat swaying gently in the post-storm breeze. The shed's door hung slightly crooked, but the latch held firm. James knelt to inspect it, running a hand along the damaged wood. "I can fix this," he said. "You don't have to." "I want to," he replied, standing. "If I can build furniture from nothing, I can certainly mend a door. Besides, this place deserves better than barely standing." Margaret smiled faintly. "So do we," she said, almost too quietly for him to hear. He looked at her then, sunlight glinting in his eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of something softer, something like possibility. They made their way around the barn, checking the roof, the fences, the animals. A few shingles torn loose, one fence post splintered, the old chicken coop beyond, saving. But compared to what could have been, it was mercy. When they finally circled back to the house, Margaret paused near the side yard where a patch of tangled weeds reached almost to her waist. She hadn't looked at it closely in years. Now, under the bright morning light, she could see the faint outlines of stones buried beneath the overgrowth. Her heart gave a strange, painful tug. "This was my mother's garden," she said quietly. "Roses, daisies, lavender." She said a home needed beauty as much as it needed food. "After she died, I let it go." James stepped beside her, gazing at the wild, neglected plot. The earth was dark and rich beneath the weeds, as though waiting patiently for someone to care again. "Do you remember where she planted everything?" he asked. "I remember every inch," she said, smiling faintly. "Even the lavender by the porch. She used to say the smell made the world softer." James crouched, running his hand through the soil. "You could bring it back, you know." Margaret shook her head. "It would take too much work. And there's always more practical things to do." "Maybe," he said. "But practical things feed the body, beauty feeds the soul. And after everything you've endured, I'd say your soul's earned a meal." She looked at him sharply, caught off guard by the gentleness in his words. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then almost reluctantly she said, "You think it's worth it, starting over?" "I think anything worth loving is worth rebuilding," he said simply. "Even gardens. Especially gardens." The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and grass, the kind of smell that always came after survival. Margaret knelt beside him, pulling a weed free from the soil. The root came loose easily, as if the land itself was ready to let go of the neglect. They worked side by side for a few minutes in silence, pulling away the worst of the overgrowth. The ground beneath was rich and dark, the stones marking what had once been tidy rows of flowers. Margaret's fingers brushed one stone, half buried and smooth. A single word was still carved faintly into its surface. "Lavender." She smiled, her throat tightening. "She planted this one first," she said. James brushed a smear of dirt from his brow and looked up at her. "Then maybe we should plant it first again." For the first time in years, Margaret felt something stir inside her that wasn't fear or grief. It was smaller, quieter, like the first green shoot breaking through hard soil. But it was there. The world had survived the night, and so had she. As they stood, the morning light fell across them, turning the wet fields to gold. James reached for her hand without thinking, his rough fingers brushing against hers. The contact was simple, innocent even, but it sent a tremor through her that reached all the way to her heart. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, they stood together, among the weeds, surrounded by the ruins of what once was and the promise of what could be. Margaret looked at the dark soil beneath her feet, at the tender shoots of green already beginning to rise through the wreckage, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, love was like this too. Something that could grow again even from the most broken ground. When James's hand found hers among the weeds, Margaret's breath caught, and she wondered, could love really grow again from such broken soil? Sometimes love begins not with promises, but with proof. The days following the storm slipped into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both found themselves craving. The land, scarred but living, became their shared purpose. Each morning the air smelled of damp soil and new beginnings. Margaret would rise early, tying her hair back, her sleeves rolled up, ready to work. James would already be outside, mending fences or reinforcing the barn door he had nearly died saving. There was a quiet steadiness to him, a kind of peace born not from ease, but from choosing to stay. They spoke little at first, their communication found more in shared tasks than in words. When Margaret lifted heavy planks, James would take the other end without asking. When he worked too long in the sun, she would silently hand him water. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something quieter, something that felt like trust growing roots in soil that had long been barren. By the third morning, the farm began to look less like a battlefield and more like a place reborn. The chickens returned to their coop. The barn roof no longer sagged, and the wheat fields shimmered gold once again. But it was the garden that changed most. Margaret found herself drawn to it every evening, standing among the weeds they had cleared, her hands deep in the soil. The more she dug, the more she unearthed fragments of her mother's care. Smooth stones, the faint outlines of planting rows, the sweet, ghostly scent of lavender clinging to the air. One afternoon she found James there before her, crouched in the dirt with a small knife and a block of walnut wood from her father's old workshop. "You shouldn't be using that wood," she said automatically, though her tone lacked conviction. "He saved it for something special." James didn't look up. "Then maybe this will qualify." Margaret folded her arms, curious despite herself. "What are you making?" He gave a small, mysterious smile. "You'll see." For the next few evenings, whenever he wasn't working on repairs, James disappeared into the tack room, the faint rasp of carving tools echoing through the quiet. Margaret didn't ask again. She told herself she didn't care, but each night when she saw the warm glow of the lamp flickering beneath the barn door, she felt something strange and unfamiliar. Anticipation. When at last he emerged, the sun was setting low, painting the world in amber and rose. His hands were stained with dust and oil, and his eyes held a nervous glint she hadn't seen before. "I made something," he said. "For you, if you want it." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, her heart thudding. "What is it?" He brought his hands forward and revealed the carving, a cross of smooth walnut wrapped with delicate vines that twisted into roses. Each petal seemed alive, shaped with the kind of patience only pain could teach. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but it was more than art. It was meaning carved into form. Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the wood. "James," she whispered, "it's beautiful." He swallowed hard. "I found your father's boards in the barn. They'd been waiting for something. I thought maybe they were waiting for this." She looked up at him, confusion and emotion warring in her eyes. "Why a cross?" James's voice softened. "The cross is for what we carry, the weight we bear, the grief that shapes us. The vines are for how life finds its way around those burdens, and the rose—" He hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. "The rose is for beauty that blooms anyway, even in hard soil." Her throat tightened. "You made this. For me?" He nodded. "For you. For this place. For remembering that hope doesn't die, it just waits for someone brave enough to dig it up again." Margaret's vision blurred. She blinked hard, trying to steady herself, but the tears came anyway. Unwelcome and unstoppable. She had cried for loss, for loneliness, for anger before, but never like this. This was different. These were tears for being seen. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to," James replied. "I just wanted you to have something that reminded you. Love can leave marks that make things more beautiful than they were before." She couldn't speak. Instead, she lifted the carving to her chest, pressing it close as if it might still be warm from his hands. The grain of the wood was smooth beneath her palms, the roses so lifelike she half expected to smell them. "It's perfect," she managed at last. He smiled, small, sincere, shy in a way that made her heart ache. "I'm glad." That evening she placed the cross in the kitchen window where the morning light would find it. It sat between the lamp and the jar of coffee beans, humble and radiant all at once. When she stepped back to look at it, she felt something shift inside her. A weight lifting, a light entering a place that had been dark for far too long. Dinner was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not cold, not lonely. It was the hush that falls when two people share something sacred. They ate by lamplight, listening to the night sounds, the steady chirp of crickets, the low whisper of wind through wheat. When the dishes were done, James excused himself to the porch. Margaret watched him through the window as he sat on the steps, his profile etched, against the starlight. She hesitated, then followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. He didn't turn when she joined him. "You can hear the frogs again," he said softly. "They only sing after the rain." "They're loud enough to wake the dead," she said. But there was a small smile in her voice. They sat in companionable quiet for a long while. The world smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. The air hummed with peace, the kind that comes not from perfection but from surviving what tried to break you. Margaret found herself studying his hands, the same hands that had carved beauty from pain. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "Carving, I mean." He thought for a moment before answering. "Because it's the only way I know to make sense of things. You take something scarred and rough and make it into something that lasts. Every mark has meaning." He glanced at her. "Maybe people are the same way." Her chest tightened. "You really believe that?" "I have to," he said. "Otherwise, what's the point of surviving anything?" She nodded, looking out into the night, her eyes stinging. The wind stirred, and the scent of roses, faint but real, drifted through the open door. Much later, after James had gone to his small cot in the tack room, Margaret lingered in the kitchen. The lamplight flickered against the carving, the vines casting faint shadows on the wall. She stepped closer, reaching out to trace the curve of one of the roses. The wood was warm from the day's sun, alive under her fingertips. Her throat tightened again, and before she knew it, she was whispering to the carving. "Thank you," she murmured, "for reminding me." She wasn't sure if she was thanking God or the man sleeping under her roof, maybe both. For the first time in years, Margaret felt peace, not the brittle kind that came from isolation, but the soft, steady peace of something beginning again. That evening, standing before the carving glowing softly in the lamplight, Margaret whispered a quiet thank you, unsure if she was speaking to God or to the man asleep just beyond her door. Some confessions are louder in silence than shouted in words. By the time midsummer settled over the plains, Creek Bend had turned from dust to gold. The wind was gentler now, the wheat whispering softly instead of screaming, and Margaret's farm no longer looked like a place haunted by loss. It looked alive. The garden, once a tangle of weeds and forgotten memories, had begun to bloom again under careful, persistent hands. Roses stretched toward the sun, lavender perfumed the air, and rows of wild daisies swayed as though the land itself had remembered what beauty felt like. Sarah Chen stood in the middle of it all, her sleeves rolled up, dirt streaking her cheek. "You've done something incredible, Margaret," she said, squinting into the sunlight. "I thought this ground was too stubborn for flowers." Margaret smiled faintly. Maybe it just needed the right hands. Sarah gave her a sidelong glance. "His hands, you mean?" Margaret tried to protest, but Sarah was already grinning. "Don't even try to deny it. Half the town's talking about how you two look at each other like you invented sunrise." The teasing made heat rise to Margaret's face. "People in this town talk too much." Sarah laughed, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Let them. It's about time they had something good to talk about. You deserve this." For a long moment, Margaret just looked around her. The garden was living proof of transformation, a patch of earth that had once been barren now bursting with color. And standing near the fence, hammer in hand, was the man who'd made it possible. James was repairing the last of the posts, sleeves rolled, sweat glinting on his skin in the afternoon light. Every movement was sure and steady, like the world itself trusted him not to falter. Sarah followed her gaze, then sighed contentedly. "He loves you, you know." Margaret's voice softened. "I know. Then what are you waiting for?" Margaret didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain that even joy felt dangerous to her. Love had burned her before, hope had betrayed her. But every time she saw James's face, his easy smile, his steady eyes, the patience in his silence, something inside her broke a little more. Later that evening, after Sarah had gone back to town, Margaret lingered in the garden. The air was cool, thick with the scent of flowers and the hum of crickets. The sun had slipped low. leaving the world in that tender space between day and night where everything felt both real and dreamlike. James appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Fence is finally finished," he said, smiling. "Good," she replied softly. "Maybe now this old place can rest." He came to stand beside her, looking over the rows of blossoms. "I don't think it's the land that's resting, Margaret. I think it's you." She turned to look at him, her heart fluttering at the quiet certainty in his voice. "You think so?" "I know so." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "You've been carrying this place alone for so long. It's allowed to feel light again." His words hit something deep inside her, something she hadn't dared touch in years. She looked down at her hands, rough from work, the faint scar on her palm from the night of the storm. "It does feel lighter," she admitted. "Because of you." He smiled, small, soft, full of something that made her chest ache. "I haven't done much." "You've done everything," she said quietly. "You reminded me what it means to hope again." He reached for her then, his hand brushing her arm, and in that simple touch the walls she'd built began to crumble. The world fell away, the farm, the night, the sound of the wind, and all that remained was the space between them charged, with all the words neither had said. "I've been trying to find the right moment," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, his voice barely more than breath. "To tell you that I'm falling in love with you." The words trembled out of her like a confession and a prayer all at once. For a heartbeat he didn't move, and panic flared in her chest. Then he let out a slow, shaky laugh, a sound so full of relief it made her want to cry. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting to hear that," he said. Before she could answer, his hands framed her face, and he kissed her. Slow at first, then with a certainty that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The world seemed to tilt, every wound, every fear, every lonely night dissolving into the warmth between them. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Margaret rested her forehead against his chest. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she murmured. He held her close, his voice rough with emotion. "Neither did I. But maybe that's how you know it's real. It finds you when you've given up looking." They stood there until the stars began to appear, their light spilling over the reborn garden. It was as though the heavens themselves were blessing the moment. The following days passed in a kind of quiet wonder. Word spread quickly through Creek Bend, as it always did, that Margaret Whitmore, the once lonely farmer who'd turned away every suitor for a decade, had finally opened her heart to a man from Pennsylvania. The same tongues that once whispered pity now carried hope. Mrs. Patterson sent over a pie to celebrate, claiming it was just to welcome James properly. Sarah appeared with fabric swatches for no reason at all. Even old Mr. Gaines at the post office gave James a firm handshake and muttered something about finally seeing sense. For the first time, Margaret didn't shrink from the attention. She let people talk because for once the story being told was one she wasn't ashamed of. A week later, as they stood together at the edge of the garden, James took her hand and said, "Margaret, I've been thinking. I know we haven't known each other long in the way the world counts it, but in letters and heart I've known you longer than anyone. I don't want to just help you run this farm. I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" Margaret's breath caught. For a moment she couldn't find words. The proposal wasn't grand. There were no flowers or rings, just the two of them standing in the garden they'd rebuilt from ruin. But somehow it felt exactly right. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He smiled, and the relief that crossed his face was so pure it almost made her laugh. Then he kissed her again, there among the roses and lavender as the evening breeze carried the scent of new beginnings through the air. That night, as she lay awake in her small room, the stars bright beyond her window, Margaret let herself dream. She imagined laughter filling the house again, music drifting through the kitchen, children's footsteps on the porch. For the first time in years, her future felt like a promise rather than a punishment. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a shadow stirred. because Margaret Whitmore had learned too well that joy often came with a cost. And as the wedding day drew nearer, that old fear, the one that whispered happiness could vanish in a heartbeat, began to whisper again, louder than she wanted to admit. As the wedding neared and the scent of roses filled the air, Margaret felt a tremor of dread deep within her heart. What if happiness, too, was just another storm waiting to break? After years of silence, even whispered vows can echo like thunder. The morning of the wedding dawned in a blaze of gold and promise. Sunlight poured across the plains, setting the wheat fields ablaze with shimmer, and the sky stretched wide and endless, a vast cathedral of blue above the town of Creek Bend. For once there was no wind, no storm, no hint of turmoil in the air. It was as if even the weather had paused in reverence, holding its breath for what was to come. Inside the small wooden church at the edge of town, Margaret Whitmore stood before a narrow mirror, smoothing the front of her simple cream-colored dress. It wasn't new, nothing she owned ever truly was, but Sarah Chen had worked her magic with needle and thread, and somehow it looked like something worthy of a bride. The muslin veil, light as mist, caught the sunlight that streamed through the window, and for a fleeting moment Margaret hardly recognized the reflection staring back at her. Sarah stepped up behind her, hands firm on her shoulders. "You look beautiful," she said, her voice steady but her eyes suspiciously bright. Margaret smiled faintly. "I don't feel beautiful. I feel terrified." "That's how you know it matters," Sarah replied, giving her a gentle squeeze. "Besides, you've already survived the hard parts. Today's the easy one." Margaret gave a small, nervous laugh. "Easy isn't a word I'd ever use for love." Sarah grinned. "Then let's call it earned." Outside, the sound of wagons arriving filled the air. Neighbors and friends from Creek Bend. People who had once whispered about that stubborn Whitmore woman now coming to see her begin anew. The scent of wildflowers drifted in through the window, mingling with the faint sweetness of Sarah's dumplings baking back at the restaurant, ready for the celebration that would follow. When the time came, Margaret stood at the back of the church alone. There was no father to give her away, no family left to escort her. For a moment, the ache of that truth tightened her throat. But then she looked down the aisle and saw James waiting for her, and the ache softened into something else entirely. He stood tall at the front, dressed in his best clothes, a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and a tie Sarah had insisted he borrow from Duncan. His hair had been combed neatly, though a few rebellious strands fell across his forehead, and his hands were clasped in front of him, the scar on his knuckles catching the sunlight like a mark of resilience rather than flaw. When the music began, a simple tune played on a fiddle by one of the townsfolk, Margaret took her first step down the aisle. Each footfall felt heavy and light all at once. The murmurs faded. The creak of pews stilled, and for the first time in her life she felt every eye on her, not with judgment but with hope. Halfway down, her gaze met James's. His expression was unguarded, filled with awe, tenderness, and something even deeper. Peace. In that instant, all her old fears seemed to dissolve. She was no longer the woman who had sworn to live and die alone. She was walking toward a man who had seen her at her worst and stayed. When she reached him, he took her hand without hesitation. His palm was warm, steady, sure. "You came," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I nearly didn't," she whispered back, a small smile trembling on her lips. "But then I remembered how you said we can't fix what's gone. We can only build what's next." He smiled at that, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Then let's build." Pastor Dunley cleared his throat gently and the ceremony began. His words were humble, as befitted a frontier preacher. He spoke not of grandeur or fairy tale romance, but of endurance, of how love was not found but made, brick by brick, through storms and silence and second chances. "Marriage," he said, "is not the promise of a perfect life. It is the vow to face an imperfect one together." Margaret's eyes blurred as she listened. Each word felt carved from her own story. When it came time for the vows, James went first. His voice was steady but full of emotion. "Margaret," he said, "you taught me that even a heart scorched by loss can learn to beat again. You gave me back the part of myself I thought the fire took. I can't promise an easy life or that I won't fail sometimes. But I'll never stop trying to make you proud you said yes." Margaret blinked rapidly, her heart swelling. When her turn came, she drew a shaky breath. "James," she began, her voice trembling, "I used to believe that love was a risk I couldn't afford. But you showed me that the greater risk is living without it. You've been patient when I've been afraid, kind when I've been cold, and honest when I've hidden behind pride. I can't promise I'll always be brave, but I can promise I'll never stop choosing you." A hush fell over the room. Outside, the wind picked up gently, brushing against the church walls as though the world itself were listening. Pastor Dunley's voice rang clear. "By the authority given to me, and by the witness of this community, I now pronounce, you husband and wife, what God has joined together, let no man tear apart." For a moment no one breathed. Then James leaned forward and kissed her, slowly, reverently, with the surety of a man who had found his way home. Applause erupted, laughter mingling with tears. Sarah cried openly in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even old Mr. Gaines cheered from the back, his voice booming like thunder. As the couple turned to face the crowd, sunlight spilled through the high church window, bathing them both in gold. Margaret couldn't help but think it looked like a blessing, the light of all they'd endured and all they were about to begin. Outside, the town gathered around them, showering them with wildflower petals and well wishes. Children chased each other through the grass, and Sarah's husband, Duncan, started up a lively tune on his fiddle. There was laughter, food, and dancing until the sun dipped low and the horizon turned the color of embers. Margaret danced once more, this time with her husband. She moved with a lightness that made her feel almost young again. The air smelled of roses, wood smoke, and summer. Every step felt like a prayer of gratitude. When twilight finally settled and the crowd began to thin, James took her hand. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Home," she echoed, and the word felt entirely new. They climbed into the wagon together, waving as the town cheered one last time. The road back to the farmhouse was quiet, lit only by the rising moon. Margaret leaned against James, her heart full in a way she'd never known. But as the farmhouse came into view, the same porch where she'd once stood alone watching storms roll in, something stirred deep inside her. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the echo of an old wound whispering that peace never came without a cost. James felt her hand tense in his and glanced down, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" he asked softly. Margaret hesitated, staring at the house that had witnessed her solitude, her struggle, her surrender. "Nothing," she said finally. "Just feels strange to have everything I ever prayed for." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's make sure we keep it." But as the night deepened and the wagon rolled toward the waiting farmhouse, the shadows seemed to lengthen around them as though even happiness had its own kind of storm brewing just beyond the horizon. As night fell and the newlyweds returned home beneath a rising moon, what began as nervous tenderness between them began to shift into something far deeper and forever binding. Love doesn't end with vows, it begins with work. The first morning of their married life began not with grand gestures or speeches, but with sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. Margaret woke to find James already up, humming softly as he worked at the stove, his sleeves rolled high and his hair still damp from washing at the pump. For a brief moment she simply lay there, watching the early light touch the carved headboard he had made with his own hands. The vines and roses etched into the wood seemed to glow, symbols of everything they had survived to stand where they now stood. When James noticed her awake, he smiled, that quiet, easy smile that always felt like home. "Morning, Mrs. Hartley," he said, setting a cup of coffee beside her. She laughed softly. "That'll take some getting used to." "Then I'll keep saying it until it feels right," he replied, and there was a warmth in his tone that carried far deeper than words. Their days fell into a new rhythm, one that felt both strange and completely natural. Margaret still rose early to tend the animals and check the fields, but now there were two sets of footsteps on the porch, two mugs of coffee cooling side by side. The silence of the house had been replaced by the comforting sounds of life, the scrape of tools, the murmur of conversation, the occasional off-key tune James would whistle while planing boards in the barn. In the corner of that same barn, he began setting up a small carpentry space. He used her father's old tools, worn but sturdy, their handles smoothed by generations of use. Soon word spread through Creek Bend that James Hartley, the furniture maker from Pennsylvania, was back in business. He started modestly, repairing chairs for Mrs. Patterson, building shelves for the general store. But each piece he crafted carried the same quiet beauty, marked with his signature vines and roses. Margaret watched him work often, fascinated by the patience in his hands. "You make it look easy," she told him one afternoon as she leaned against the doorway, wiping dirt from her palms. "It's never easy," he said without looking up. "But the hard parts are what make it worth doing." She smiled. "That sounds suspiciously like marriage." He laughed, glancing up long enough to meet her gaze. "Then I guess I'm in the right trade." The house began to transform around them. Together they replaced the warped floorboards in the parlor and built new shelves for the kitchen. James carved a sturdy dining table, large enough for a family they didn't yet have, and Margaret sewed curtains from faded but well-loved fabric, brightening the windows that had once framed only loneliness. Bit by bit their home began to look less like a place of survival and more like a place of belonging. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit by the fire with tea or whiskey and talk, sometimes about the future, a larger barn perhaps, or expanding the wheat fields, other times about the past, the ghosts that still lingered quietly between them. Margaret spoke of her late husband less often now, not because she'd forgotten him, but because the ache had softened into gratitude for what had been and what had come after. James rarely spoke of the fire that had taken his first wife, but one night as the snow fell outside and the flames in the hearth burned low, he told Margaret about it, the smell of smoke, the way the heat had pressed against his lungs, the helplessness. She didn't try to comfort him with words. Instead, she simply took his hand, held it, and in that silence, something deeper than comfort passed between them, understanding. By spring, the farm was thriving. The garden, once choked by neglect, had come to life in a riot of color. Roses climbing the fence posts, lavender scenting the breeze, daisies nodding their bright faces to the sun. Margaret spent hours among them, her hands in the soil, her spirit lighter than she could remember. Sometimes James would join her, sitting in the grass with his carving knife, shaping wood while she weeded and watered. The air between them would fill with the soft music of work. Knife against grain, hand against earth, heart against heart. It was in that season of creation that Margaret first suspected the change. At first it was small things, fatigue that clung longer than usual, the sudden nausea at the smell of fried bacon, the way her dresses fit a little tighter around the waist. She told herself it was just the strain of long days. But when a week passed without her monthly bleeding, she knew. That evening she found James in the barn, sanding the edge of a cradle he was making for another family in town. Her heart thudded as she watched him, the lantern light flickering across his face. For a long moment she simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to find words for something too enormous to speak. "James," she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. He turned immediately, concern flashing in his eyes. "What is it? Are you all right?" She swallowed, then smiled, a tremulous, disbelieving smile. I think I'm with child." For a moment the world seemed to stop. The steady rhythm of the night, the creak of wood, the rustle of hay, faded into silence. Then James set down his tools and crossed the space between them in 2 strides. His hands, calloused and gentle, came to rest on her arms. "Are you sure?" "Not certain yet," she said, tears stinging her eyes. "But I think so." He let out a soft, breathless laugh, as if afraid too much joy might shatter the moment. "Margaret," his voice broke. "A baby?" She nodded, her own tears spilling freely now. "A baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were something sacred. She could feel the tremor in his chest, the mix of wonder and fear. "I never thought I'd have this again," he murmured. "A family. A chance to start over." Margaret rested her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd have this at all." The days that followed were filled with cautious hope. Margaret was careful not to overwork herself, though she still insisted on tending the garden. James fussed over her endlessly, bringing her tea, taking over chores, building small things for the nursery they hadn't even prepared yet. It was both sweet and maddening. "You're treating me like glass," she said one morning, half laughing, half scolding. He smiled sheepishly. "That's because you're carrying something far more precious than glass." As autumn gave way to early snow, the farmhouse felt warmer than it ever had before. They spent evenings by the fire, James carving toys he swore were practice pieces, and Margaret knitting tiny garments she wasn't yet brave enough to call baby clothes. One night, as the snow fell in thick silence outside and the world seemed to hold its breath, Margaret felt it, a flutter, faint but unmistakable. She gasped softly, pressing a hand to her belly. "James," she whispered, eyes wide. He turned from the fire. "What is it?" She smiled through sudden tears. "It kicked." James knelt beside her, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. He placed his hand gently where hers rested, and when he felt the next movement, his breath caught. "That's our child," he whispered. Margaret nodded, her throat too tight for words. In that moment, surrounded by warmth and the steady pulse of new life, she thought that perhaps the world had never been so beautiful. As the snow thickened outside and the fire crackled low, Margaret felt the tiny kick again, so full of life it almost hurt, and wondered with trembling hope if joy this pure could truly last. Some miracles cry out loud enough to heal the silence of years. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year, retreating like an old soldier weary from battle. By March, the snow began to melt, turning the ground soft and rich again. Tiny green shoots pushed up through the thawing earth, proof that the world still knew how to begin again. Margaret felt those same stirrings within her, renewal, rebirth, and the anxious anticipation of what was to come. Her belly had grown round and firm, her movements slower but still purposeful. James refused to let her lift anything heavier than a basket of laundry, though she teased him endlessly for his overprotective nature. "James Hartley," she said one morning as he hurried to take a crate of firewood from her arms, "I was hauling heavier things than this before you ever stepped off that train." He grinned, that patient, infuriating grin. "You weren't carrying half of me then, were you?" His words made her laugh despite herself, though there was truth in them. She was carrying something of him now, of both of them, a living symbol of everything they'd survived. At night, when the baby moved, she would take his hand and place it gently on her belly, feeling him go still as the faint motion pressed against his palm. Those quiet moments were more intimate than any words. When the first warm wind of April swept across the plains, the world erupted into bloom. The garden outside the farmhouse was alive with color again. Roses, lavender, daisies, and hollyhocks, all thriving in the soil they had once feared barren. Margaret often sat on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sun sink low and feeling the baby shift with the rhythm of her heartbeat. She talked softly to the life inside her, telling stories about the farm, about her mother, about the man who had come from far away and changed everything. The day of the birth came just as the garden burst into full bloom. It was early morning when Margaret's first pain struck, sharp and certain. She gripped the edge of the table, steadying herself, breathing through the wave. James rushed to her side, his face pale but resolute. "I'll get Sarah," he said. And before she could protest, he was out the door, galloping toward town like a man chasing salvation. By the time he returned with Sarah and Mrs. Patterson, the contractions were strong and close together. The farmhouse filled with quiet urgency, the soft shuffle of feet, the rustle of linens, the low murmur of encouragement. Sarah took command with the calm authority of someone who had ushered dozens of babies into the world. "You're strong, Margaret," she said firmly. "You've done harder things than this. Now breathe and let the world make room for her." Her. The word echoed through the room like a promise. Hours passed in a blur of pain, prayer, and sheer determination. James never left her side, holding her hand so tightly she thought she might bruise. At one point she saw tears in his eyes, but he didn't falter, whispering words of love and strength between her cries. Then at last the air filled with the sound Margaret had longed for without even knowing it. The sharp, perfect cry of new life. Sarah lifted the tiny, squirming baby and smiled. "A girl," she announced. "Strong lungs just like her mother." Margaret laughed and wept all at once. When Sarah placed the child in her arms, she stared down in awe. The baby was small and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and fists clenched tight. But to Margaret, she was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome home." James knelt beside the bed, his expression undone. He reached out, touching one small hand with trembling fingers. "She's perfect," he breathed. "She's ours." "Rose," Margaret said softly, tears still streaming down her face. Rose Elizabeth Hartley. The name settled between them like sunlight breaking through clouds. By the time the sun rose fully over the horizon, the entire house seemed transformed. The air felt new, the walls brighter, the old silence replaced by the soft sounds of breathing and life. Sarah brewed tea while Mrs. Patterson cleaned up, both women exchanging knowing glances, the kind shared between midwives who've witnessed the sacred cycle of beginnings countless times. That Sunday, beneath the wide Montana sky, Pastor Dunley baptized the baby under the old oak tree by the farmhouse. The entire town came, neighbors, friends, and even those who'd once pitied Margaret from afar. Sarah and her husband Duncan stood proudly as godparents. The pastor's voice carried over the wind, solemn and joyful all at once. "May she grow strong in love and in grace," he said, pouring cool water over the baby's brow. Rose blinked but didn't cry, her small fingers gripping James's thumb as if she already knew the world was safe in his arms. The months that followed were a season of gentle abundance. Margaret's laughter returned in full measure, her eyes brighter than they'd been in years. James built a cradle from rich walnut wood, carving the same vines and roses into its sides that had adorned their headboard. Each night when he rocked their daughter to sleep, the creak of the wood was a lullaby of love and renewal. The farm thrived under their care. The wheat grew tall and golden, the livestock flourished, and the garden became a riot of color that drew visitors from miles around. Margaret taught Rose to walk between rows of lavender, her little hands outstretched to touch the blooms. Years passed and their family grew. 2 years after Rose came a son, Thomas James Hartley, named for both the man Margaret had lost and the one she had found. He had James's calm eyes and Margaret's stubborn streak, a combination that kept both parents on their toes. 3 years later, another daughter arrived, Sarah Margaret Hartley, named in honor of the woman who had first given Margaret the courage to hope again. Their house expanded with each child. James built new rooms, a parlor for guests, a nursery bright with sunlight, and later a workshop large enough to handle his growing commissions. His furniture became known across the county, prized not just for its craftsmanship but for the quiet spirit of beauty that seemed to dwell within each piece. Margaret's garden became her sanctuary. The flowers thrived, and each spring the roses bloomed more fiercely than before. The garden had once been her mother's legacy of love. Now it was her own, a living testament to resilience, to choosing joy after sorrow. By their 10th year together, life had woven itself into a rhythm that felt eternal. Rose was nearly 12, tall and wise beyond her years. Thomas, at 8, followed his father everywhere, eager to learn the ways of wood and work. Little Sarah, only 5, had her mother's laugh and a habit of talking to the flowers as though they were friends. On their anniversary evening, Margaret and James sat on the porch as the sun dipped low over the prairie, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The sound of their children's laughter drifted across the yard, mingling with the steady hum of crickets and the faint rustle of wheat. James reached over, lacing his fingers with hers. 10 years, he murmured. Can you believe it? Margaret smiled softly, watching the horizon fade into twilight. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like forever. He turned to her, his expression full of quiet wonder. Both sound just about right. She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sawdust and sun. We built something good, James. Something real. He pressed a kiss to her temple. We built a life. As the sun slipped beneath the edge of the world, Margaret looked at her husband, the man who'd once been a stranger stepping off a train, and realized with quiet certainty that what they'd built was no longer just love. It was something eternal, something that would outlive them both. The storms may fade, but love, once planted, never stops growing. By the time the next decade rolled gently into the Hartley homestead, the house on the Montana prairie no longer looked like the lonely outpost it once had. The fences were strong, the barn freshly painted, and the fields stretched out in golden perfection toward the horizon. The laughter of children carried on the wind, clear, bright, and full of the kind of joy Margaret once believed she'd buried with her grief. Every board, every blossom, every stone on that land bore the touch of two people who had refused to let life's storms destroy them. It was late summer, the air rich with the scent of wheat and roses, when Margaret stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The evening sun dipped low, spilling molten light across the fields. James sat in his usual place at the porch rail, whittling a small block of wood, his silver-threaded hair catching the last glow of daylight. He looked up as she joined him, his face creasing into that familiar, easy smile that had anchored her through every season. "You'll wear that knife down to nothing," she teased, settling beside him. "Maybe," he said, brushing a curl of shavings from his lap. "But there's always another piece of wood waiting. Always another thing to make beautiful." Margaret smiled, her gaze wandering to the yard where their children played. Rose, now 12, was helping little Sarah chase fireflies with a jar, while Thomas pretended to be a brave sheriff guarding his town, made of fence posts and imagination. Their laughter mixed with the soft chirping of crickets, filling the twilight with music. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "how close we came to missing all this?" James stopped carving and looked at her. "Every day," he said simply. "But I figure that's what makes it precious." Margaret nodded. The years had softened her, but they hadn't erased the weight of memory. There were still nights when she woke to the sound of distant thunder and had to remind herself that she wasn't alone, that the storm outside wasn't a metaphor for the one within. But the difference now was that James was there beside her, steady and constant. The porch creaked as he leaned back, watching the sun sink lower. "You ever think about that first night?" he asked, a wry grin tugging at his lips. "The storm, the splinter. You with that needle, me bleeding all over your kitchen?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You looked like a fool standing out in that rain. And you looked like someone worth getting drenched for," he replied without hesitation. Margaret rolled her eyes, though her smile betrayed her. "You always did have a way with words. Only when I mean them," he said, his voice turning gentle. Silence fell between them, comfortable and full. The air shimmered with the last breath of summer. From the kitchen window, the carved walnut cross still caught the dying light, its roses gleaming like living things. It had sat in that window for 10 years now, unchanged, though everything around it had grown and evolved. "It's strange," Margaret murmured, her eyes on the cross. "How something so small can hold so much of a story." James followed her gaze. "That's what love does, I think. leaves marks that tell you where you've been and who you became because of it. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of labor. "I used to think love was fragile," she said softly, "that it could be taken as easily as the wind takes a harvest. But I was wrong. It's stronger than anything I've ever known." He turned his palm upward, linking their fingers. "Because we made it so. We tended it, watered it when it went dry. That's what love is. It's work that never stops." The sky deepened into gold and violet, the first stars appearing like shy witnesses to their peace. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of an owl echoed. Inside, the house glowed warm through its windows, the lamplight flickering against the hand-carved furniture that told their history in silent, elegant patterns. Everywhere James's hands had touched, beauty had bloomed. The dining table bore their initials carved discreetly beneath the surface. The headboard in their room still held the scent of walnut oil and love's devotion. The cradle he'd built for Rose now rocked their youngest, Daniel, barely 6 months old, his small cries soft and content in the night. Margaret thought of that cradle often, of the life that had once begun there, of the countless nights she'd stood beside it, whispering lullabies while the wind sang through the wheat. It had become more than a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of the life they'd chosen to build from the ashes of their pain. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. James frowned slightly. "Miss what?" "The loneliness," she said. "The silence, the part of you that belonged only to yourself." He was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. "No," he said finally, "but I remember it. I think that's important, to remember. Otherwise you forget why you keep working to hold on to what you've got." Margaret nodded. The truth of his words settled deep inside her. She looked out at the horizon again, where the last light bled into shadow. The land that had once seemed endless and cruel now felt like home. Every scar on it told a story. The repaired barn, the re-fenced fields, the garden that had returned to glory. Ah, the garden. It had grown wild again in the best possible way. Roses climbed the trellis James had built, thick and blooming in every shade from blush to crimson. Lavender perfumed the air, mingling with the sweetness of clover. The stone markers her mother had once painted with plant names still stood, weathered but legible, a quiet bridge between past and present. When Margaret walked through it now, she often felt as if she could hear echoes of laughter, the hum of her mother's voice, the faint strains of the dance she and James had shared in that storm-dark kitchen all those years ago. Every season brought new blooms and with them new memories. As the stars brightened overhead, the children's laughter faded, replaced by yawns and calls for bedtime. Rose gathered her siblings and led them inside, their bare feet pattering softly across the porch. Margaret watched them go, her heart full to bursting. James rose from his chair and stretched, the faint creak of age in his shoulders. "We've done all right, haven't we?" he said quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Better than all right." He smiled and leaned down, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "Guess we built what we set out to build after all." Margaret stood, slipping her arm through his. Together they gazed out across their land one last time that day. The wheat glowing silver under the moonlight, the roses nodding gently in the night breeze, the faint scent of earth and life rising around them. Everywhere she looked, she saw traces of their story. Two people who had chosen to plant hope where despair once lived, who had turned grief into growth and loneliness into legacy. As they stepped back inside, Margaret paused at the kitchen window. The carved cross caught her eye again, its rose still gleaming in the lamplight. For a moment she pressed her fingers against the glass, her reflection merging with it. "Love should leave its mark," James had said once, and it had. On the house, on the land, on their hearts. Love, once planted in honest soil, never truly dies. It marks everything it touches, scars, wood, earth, and soul, until even the broken things shine with beauty. And standing there in her kitchen with her husband's laughter echoing in the next room and the scent of roses drifting through the open window, Margaret finally understood. Their love hadn't just survived the storms. It had become the roots that would never die. And that was the story of Margaret and James Hartley, two hearts that proved love can bloom even in the ashes of loss. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what part moved you most. Hit subscribe if you believe in second chances and share this video with someone who still believes love can find you, no matter how lost you feel. Because stories like this remind us all, the roots of love never really die. They just wait for someone brave enough to plant again.